All rise, please. Welcome to Day 6 of evidential hearings at the Undercover Policing Inquiry. My name is Neil Fernandez and I am the hearings manager. There is no fire alarm testing expected today, so if the fire alarm does go off, please follow the fire exit signs and make your way to the muster point, which is the Hard Rock Hotel, Great Cumberland Place. On arrival, please make yourself known to a fire marshal who will be wearing a high visibility jacket and will be keeping a register of all attendees. I now hand over to the chairman, Sir John Mitting, to formally start today's proceedings. Chairman.
Thank you. As always, I begin with a message to those in the public area. You may use any handheld electronic device that you have to communicate what you see and hear in the hearing room, but only once 10 minutes have elapsed since the event that you are describing. You may not use them for the purpose of recording what is going on here or photographing. Ms. Campbell.
Thank you, sir. This morning I'll be presenting the summary of the evidence of HN 368, Richard James Walker. Richard Walker was a detective sergeant in the SDS back office from September 1974 to April 1978. He provided a witness statement to the inquiry dated the 5th of November 2020, which may be summarized as follows. Richard Walker joined the Metropolitan Police Service as a junior cadet in 1954 and became a full constable in 1956. He joined Special Branch in 1966 and served in various positions prior to the SDS, including dealing with inquiries and intelligence gathering in relation to extreme left-wing matters, for which he received a commendation. He worked on security vetting and held one role dealing with extremist groups in the Indian and Pakistani communities in London, which consisted of intelligence gathering and liaison with A8 in relation to demonstrations. He joined the SDS in September 1974. He was asked to join by DI Derek Bryce, whom Walker knew from a previous posting. He did not know much about the SDS before joining, as there was a strict need-to-know policy in Special Branch. He cannot remember being given a handover when he started, but believes that he would have had one. He did not receive any specific training for the role. Richard Walker describes himself as effectively the, quote, quartermaster of the SDS. He would help source and administer vehicles, assist in arrangements for accommodation for UCOs, ran the petty cash book, and paid various bills. He had no involvement in the creation of cover identities, procurement of cover documents, or procurement of cover accommodation. Richard Walker would attend the weekly meetings at the safe houses with the undercover officers. He recalls that detective inspectors, and more junior ranked officers in the SDS office would also attend weekly, and the superintendent and chief superintendent would go less often. At the meetings, UCOs would submit their diaries and expenses and provide reports. Management would check in with the UCOs to see how they were. Walker states, quote, there would be general chat. We would ask about their problems, if there were any, and make sure that they were happy in their work. The UCOs were working in difficult conditions and with some unpleasant people, and when I was in the office, the welfare aspect of our role was important, end quote. He does not recall any officers spending time in the back office in advance of their deployment or after their withdrawal from the field. He was not aware of any unhappy working relationships in the SDS. Richard Walker did have a role in compiling the reporting from undercover officers. Officers would give report updates in writing and orally at meetings and may have occasionally called the office to give information over the phone. He notes, quote, there was no filter on what they were meant to do or say in terms of reporting. Walker states that he would look at the manuscript reports and would make suggested changes to the language to make it more formal or grammatically correct. He did not change the substance of the reports. He notes that Special Branch had exacting standards of written English, and they were aware that reporting was likely to go to the Home Office and Security Service, so high standards were applied. Walker recalls that contact with the UCOs was at least once a week face-to-face, and that officers could ask for one-to-one meetings with managers if they wished. He considered himself to have a role in the welfare of the undercover officers, ensuring the smooth running of some of the administration connected to their duties. Quote, all of the back office SDS staff had a role in making sure the UCOs could cope emotionally with the work they were doing. This was done by talking to them. If they had any problems, they would be seen and spoken to. We tried to do the best we could to keep in touch with people who were doing a difficult job. I am still proud of the work that we did, and I thought that we had done what we could do to provide support to the UCOs, end quote. Richard Walker denies playing any role in directing or steering the reporting of undercover officers, and indeed was not aware of any SDS officer directing or steering UCO reporting while he was in the unit. When asked about his signature on several intelligence reports, he explains that he may have signed as the person submitting those particular pieces of information for typing, rather than as the source of the intelligence. Richard Walker describes the arrangements in place for the storage and retention of intelligence reports. He explains that Special Branch had an enormous registry of files, but there were also safes in every office for the temporary storage of documents. Quote, we would keep files in the SDS if they were topical at the time, so there may have been files, including SDS reporting, which were locked in the office for a period. For example, if there was an officer in the Troops Out movement, there would be a file which the SDS would maintain, and once it was not current, it would go to the registry, end quote. He does not know how long records were maintained for. He states that he had no role in the dissemination of the reporting. However, he was aware that reports would have gone to other parts of Special Branch, the Security Service, A8, or other agencies. He expects that there may have been some modification of reports depending on who the ultimate recipient was. For example, reports sent to A8 may not have included PF and RF reference numbers. Richard Walker states that he had no general contact with the Security Service at the time. When asked about his name appearing on a guest list of Special Branch members invited to a Security Service party in February 1978, Walker speculates that Special Branch may have been asked to put forward a number of officers to attend, as he does not know any other reason why he was included. He recalls the party as being, quote, somewhat awkward, as the Security Service had obviously typecast the group of Special Branch officers as being beer-drinking policemen, so I felt we had been stereotyped, end quote. Richard Walker was involved in the payment of overtime to officers. He was not responsible for authorizing overtime, but would check officer diaries to ensure their claims were accurate and submit them to the payment department. He notes that the keeping of overtime diaries was a force-wide obligation below a certain rank and not particular to the SDS. Although he thought that the benefits of overtime may have caused officers to want to remain in the SDS, he notes that it would not be up to the officers to decide if they remain past the normal deployment length. He does not believe the amount of overtime influenced any officer to paint an overly optimistic picture of their achievements. During his time in the SDS, Richard Walker traveled on more than one occasion to accompany UCOs attending events outside of London. This included a trip to Blackburn for an Action Against Racism demonstration in 1976, for which he and D.I. McIntosh received a letter of thanks from Lancashire Police. He states, quote, managers and administrative staff would travel to the same part of the country as a UCO in limited circumstances. As far as I recall, it would have been in circumstances where there could have been a risk to them, whether in terms of a risk to violence or a risk of arrest in the course of their duties, end quote. The number of SDS officers involved may have also been a factor in assessing where support was needed. Walker notes that staff were present for the safety and welfare of the UCOs and to be on hand in case there was any action against them by local police. The UCOs would have been aware of the presence of the accompanying staff. Such trips may also have required liaison with the local force or constabulary. Richard Walker signs the transport reports present in the 1976 and 1977 SDS annual reports, but does not believe that he was involved in compiling the annual reports beyond this aspect. He does believe the contents of those reports to be an honest reflection of the work of the SDS. He agrees with comments made in the 1978 annual report that undercover deployments did not seem to have any deleterious effect on the health of UCOs. Walker notes that the officers did get very tired due to the hours they worked, but he cannot recall any particular mental or physical health problems. In terms of issues that arose with contemporaneous undercover officers, Walker accepts that he would have probably known at the time about the first arrest of HN 13, cover name Desmond Barry Loader, but was not involved in any way with dealing with it. He has no recollection of the possible compromises relating to HN 126, cover name Paul Gray, but notes that, quote, "The UCOs had to handle risks like this. We trust them to manage them appropriately. If a UCO felt worried about compromise, we would have pulled them out in a manner which was safe for them, but which did not arouse suspicion." He was not aware of any officers engaging in sexual activity while in their cover identity, including HN 21, HN 354 Vince Harvey, and HN 297 Richard Clark. Walker was not aware of any colleagues or managers knowing of any sexual relationships, and expects that if they did, he would have heard about it in the office. He was not aware of any manager giving UCOs orders, instructions, advice, or guidance about sexual conduct whilst operating undercover. When asked to comment on the evidence of HN 304, cover name Graham Coates, that managers, quote, appeared to turn a blind eye to bits of banter and innuendo, and that they, quote, must have known it, meaning sexual activity, was almost bound to happen with certain individuals who had a predilection for chasing women. Richard Walker states that he disagrees with this account. He comments, quote, "I think there was an expectation that the UCOs would behave, rather than an expectation that they would misbehave. There was very little banter, as I recall, and I certainly would not have turned a blind eye to anything I thought had a ring of truth to it. I categorically do not agree with the comment on predilection. I certainly had not judged anyone on that basis. Men who say things about women don't always mean it, or follow through with what they say." He confirms that had he known about sexual activity with activists, he would not have condoned it. To his knowledge, none of his contemporaries provoked or encouraged a third party to commit a criminal offense, engaged in sexual activity whilst in their cover identity, were involved in incidents of public order or violence, reported on any legally privileged information, or reported on the activities of elected politicians. Aside from HN 13, he did not know of any officers who were arrested, tried, or convicted in their cover identity. He believes that the activities of trade unions would only have been reported on if trade union members were part of the group that the UCO had infiltrated and the information was relevant to that group. Richard Walker was aware of deceased children's identities being used at the time, but cannot comment on the origin of the practice or any consideration given to its use. He comments, quote, "I can say that it obviously wasn't thought through, and I can understand how the parents of the dead children are upset. I think the SDS did not think the families would find out." When asked to comment on why certain information was reported by undercover officers, Richard Walker notes that, quote, "The SDS was a conduit, and action requests for information. The SDS recorded information and did not filter the information gathered, as the SDS were not gathering it for our own purposes. We acted on behalf of other persons with no oversight of the broader purpose of the information. In terms of what the SDS achieved for the benefit of policing, Richard Walker states, quote, "I can say that it obtained all of the requests for intelligence on public order and national security that were requested of it when I was involved. I would not have known that everything we were asked to get was later directed to, so it is hard for me to quantify the benefit. It was very much a case that the SDS did what they were asked to do and didn't question it. If the SDS was given a target, the order was not queried. It was actioned. Personally, I felt that the SDS achieved the goals that we had been set for the benefit of policing, and I certainly thought we were doing the right thing at the right time." Richard Walker left the SDS after 3.5 years, which was the expected length of his posting. He does not believe he had much, if any, contact with information emanating from the SDS in subsequent special branch roles, which were primarily in the field of Irish terrorism. He retired from the MPS in 1987 at the rank of Detective Superintendent. Thank you, sir. That concludes the summary for Richard Walker. Documents related to this manager will be published online today, as well as the documents related to HN 1668 Les Willingale, who was Detective Sergeant in the SDS from approximately August 1975 to February 1977, and thereafter was Detective Inspector in the SDS until approximately December 1977. He is deceased. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We'll now adjourn for 10 minutes to enable arrangements to be made to hear our next live witness, Angus McIntosh.
All rise, please.
Mr. McIntosh, I understand you wish to be sworn.
Right.
Yes, Mr. Fernandez
you,
will
sir.
administer the oath to you.
Thank you. Please place your Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear,
I swear
by Almighty God,
by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Chair.
Please. Miss Humberston.
Can you give us your full name, please?
Angus Brian McIntosh.
You have provided a witness statement dated the 16th of February 2021. Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true and accurate to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
You joined the SDS in April 1976, you tell us in your witness statement, at the rank of Detective Inspector, and you were second in command at the SDS, is that right?
That is correct.
Prior to joining the SDS, you joined Special Branch in 1964, is that right?
I believe so, yes.
So by the time you joined the SDS, you were an experienced Special Branch officer.
Yes.
You spent some time on C Squad prior to your time in the SDS, is that right?
My initial period in Special Branch, yes.
After your initial period in C Squad, did you spend any more time in C Squad in that time before you joined the SDS?
No.
Thank you, because you go into other squads that you joined in that intervening period. During your time in Special Branch prior to your time in the SDS, did you have any knowing interaction with the SDS?
None at all.
And were you aware of any traffic of information from the SDS to any squad you were serving with, or the other direction, requests going out?
I didn't see any.
You tell us in your witness statement that your Special Branch experience gave you a knowledge of the organisations that the UCOs would be dealing with, and the reporting structure in Special Branch, and the likely pitfalls that UCOs might come across during the course of their deployment. Is that right?
That's correct.
And is that the extent of the ways in which your Special Branch experience assisted you with your SDS role?
You're asking me how it did? Sorry.
Is it your knowledge of the organisations, the reporting structure, and also likely pitfalls for UCOs? Are those the three things that you learnt prior to coming to the SDS,
That is
which
quite
were the three
correct.
things that assisted you in your SDS role?
Yes.
Just a few questions, please, about police training. You were trained, presumably, on basic police powers of entry, search and seizure when you became a police officer. Would that be right?
That's true. We had a 13-week course when you first joined, and then throughout your service you had various courses, including CID courses and promotion courses.
Was there any further training given on that topic, powers of entry, search and seizure, when you joined Special Branch? Can you remember?
Not that I can recall.
When you joined Special Branch in 1964, did you then have further training for that role?
In branch, yes, but it was mainly done through a mentor.
Right, thank you. I wonder if we can just have up on the screen, very briefly, please, UCPI 34702, please. This is a document from 1979, so not at the time when you first joined Special Branch. This is said to be initial training for Special Branch officers. Did you go through initial training for Special Branch officers that you can recall?
No, in fact, that course started just after I'd left the SDS. Prior to that, there were no special courses, as far as I'm aware.
Thank you very much. I think we can then take that document down, because I don't think you're going to be able to assist me with its contents. We know that you undertook some training at Brams Hill during the course of your time at the SDS. You had 2 periods at Brams Hill. Was that Special Branch training that you undertook there?
No.
No.
General police.
Thank you very much. Can you assist us with what sort of thing it covered, that training, if you can recall?
Not really. It catered for people of inspector rank and possible higher rank in due course. And it was a general training course in both on the legal side and also on the social attitudes of the time.
Right. Did it cover anything to do with undercover work or supervising undercover work?
Nothing at all.
Did you have any understanding of how basic police officers' powers of entry, search and seizure applied to officers working undercover?
Well, it was felt that working undercover, providing they were there and invited into the premises, there wasn't a problem. They were going with whatever group or comrades they were with at the time. And it couldn't be constructed any other way, purely because they couldn't stop at a door and suddenly turn around and say, I can't go in there. And it would have jeopardised their cover.
Was that something that was actively considered then, that people gave some sort of scrutiny to the idea as to how that difficulty would be overcome by UCOs during your time there, do you recall?
No, I don't recall any special.
And so you say that was the prevailing opinion, that so long as consent was
well, that
given.
was a general policing rule.
Right. Thank you very much. You, by the inquiry's calculation, when you first joined the SDS, the unit was headed up by Geoffrey Craft, and we understand you have no memory of serving at the same time as him. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Although it would appear that there are documents that indicate he's signing off matters to do with you. For example, I think it's he that signs the document seeking permission for you and Detective Sergeant Walker to accompany some SDS officers to Blackburn. Can you remember accompanying officers to Blackburn?
I remember going there, and I really can't understand why I can't recall working with Mr. Craft. I can only presume that the major incidents which may have occurred during that time was during a period I was on other courses. Being a newly promoted inspector, you were obliged to attend a 6-week promotion course, and there was also a 6-week general duties CID course. Now, I can't tell the committee, the inquiry, exactly when I went on that, but I presume as a newly promoted officer, I would have done during that period.
And are these separate courses from the courses at Bramshill for which, and we've got those dates, haven't we?
Completely independent, run by the Metropolitan Police. I think they were all at Hendon.
So you had at least, you think, probably 12 weeks of training in that first period when you were first promoted to detective inspector?
Yes, I believe I must have done. I certainly did those courses, but I can't be exact on the dates.
Thank you.
Forgive me, that's in addition to the 13-week course at Bramshill.
Absolutely, sir.
To your recollection, was Mike Ferguson the DCI at the SDS throughout your period there then, or can you recall a period when he may not have been?
Well, there must have been a period when he
Yes.
wasn't, but I wasn't able to say that when I made the statement, because I didn't remember working with Jeff Craft.
Right, thank you. Moving on to duties that you carried out, you said you received informal guidance from Mike Ferguson on administrative duties, how cover identities were created, and the methods of introducing new officers and undercover officers, and meetings with undercover officers, and you say that training was ad hoc. As the problem or issue arose, you were then learnt how to deal with it. Is that a fair
Basically,
assessment?
that's correct. I mean, it didn't all come from Michael Ferguson, because it was carried through from previous management. And so when I joined the squad, many of the practices were already in hand.
Did you have any sort of handover from the person who had your role previously? Can you recall?
I'm pretty certain, no. It wasn't the normal thing in those days. You didn't have handover. You were just told to take up a job on Monday, whatever.
Right. Were you given any guidance as to how you should advise the undercover officers as to their conduct in that role, how they should conduct themselves?
I wasn't given specific guidance, but my guidance, which I gave to the officers, was you are police officers, you're subject to the regulations, and therefore your behaviour has to be appropriate to those regulations.
Right. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about that in a little while. Did Mike Ferguson share with you how to identify the risks associated with undercover policing, for example, the risks of compromise or arrests or relationships with activists or other welfare considerations, the sort of things you needed to look out for and safeguard
He
against?
made me very aware of those things and the high risk of the occupation.
Was any reference made to any past difficulties encountered, officers being arrested or any welfare difficulties in the past? Any sort of collective knowledge of difficulties in the past passed on to you?
Not specific, because whatever the difficulties were in the past had been catered for within ongoing operations and recruitment of our own officers to go out.
We have heard from an officer who gave evidence in closed session about a black folder in the SDS Black Office containing notes from previous officers about tradecraft. Can you recall any such black folder in the back office during your time at the SDS?
I think there was such a folder. I can't remember specific contents. However, it would make sense that officers leaving the squad would actually leave record of any advice to new undercover officers. So I would think what happened, that the folder was kept by the sergeants who were handling all the admin problems, and during their time, the new members' time in the back office, they would refer to that folder.
Can you recall looking at the folder yourself?
I can't, no.
Can you assist us with what any more specifically about what the contents might have been?
Well, I can't be specific, but I presume it would be tradecraft advice, what your possible difficulties experiences would be.
Do you think that UCOs were advised to look at that folder and review the advice given in that folder?
I would feel almost certain that everyone looked at it once it was created, because it was full of good advice for the new officers.
Was there any, you say you weren't aware specifically of the contents of that folder. Would there have been, do you think, any sort of managerial oversight of the contents of that folder?
I can't answer that.
No, to ensure that best practices were passed down?
No. You say oversight. Management certainly wouldn't have put in their own views.
No. If there was something in that folder which was may have been bad advice, do you think that might be picked up by senior managers?
I'm certain that when they were debriefed, the management would hear what the problems were and would be aware of the type of information the officer would have put into that folder. I mean, the difficulties experienced by officers needed to be shared with other officers so that they didn't fall into the same trap.
Yes. Mike Ferguson, of course, had previously been deployed. He was an experienced undercover officer, and you say that he would take the lead on providing instructions on tactics and the practicalities of being undercover. The impression given from your witness statements is that he built on his own experience as a former SDS officer. Is that a fair
Absolutely. That's the only way you could do it, really.
Thank you. I just want to ask a little more detail about the guidance that was given to undercover officers about their conduct when they were deployed undercover. Were officers given any specific advice about drinking alcohol in their undercover roles?
Other than the need to be aware of the dangers of drink and driving, it wouldn't be lightly specific. And the reason for that is that they were police officers. They've all come up through the training system, a disciplinary system, and they knew quite well, because you have examinations all the time, there's no reason to suggest that they didn't know that the disciplinary result of any misbehaviour would be very, very serious.
Was there any recognition, though, that this was a very different role that they were undertaking where their whole life had become their work, and that alcohol may cause difficulty for them in undertaking that work
Well,
responsibly?
I think they knew that, and you're quite right. It was a very difficult thing to have a double life, and certainly to keep in with the crowd. Excuse me, the crowd they were interested in. As far as the consumption of alcohol was concerned, the major problem was drink and driving. Each officer had a vehicle, and the laws of drink and driving existed in those days, and they couldn't afford to get into trouble and lose their license, and they had no job. As far as the formal discipline would be concerned, it'd be up to the chief officer to take into account what the job was.
So the main anxiety was about drinking and driving rather than the disinhibiting effects of alcohol
Yes.
in a close-knit social group, because we've heard that alcohol has played its part
Well, I'm
in
sure
the
it
sexual
has,
encounters
yes.
undertaken by UCOs. But that wasn't something that you bore in mind at the time.
No, it's a very difficult problem. You're asking them to do a job which basically is quite alien to their training. You also have to appreciate that they are working in an environment, or having to work in an environment, where that environment have their own standards. And to be successful in that environment, you have to join them. But as an undercover officer, you have this additional problem of knowing that there's certain things you can't do.
Thank you. How about any guidance on the conduct of personal relationships and the limits of those relationships, and perhaps the guarding against building up too close a connection with people they came across in their undercover roles?
No, I don't think there was official guidance. That was the type of thing that the chief inspector I was working with, or myself, if it was brought up in discussion, we would advise them of the difficulties and the problems which it might entail.
So that formed the basis of some informal guidance if it came up in an individual deployment, is that?
It would be informal or personal guidance rather than laid down regulation.
But it didn't form any basis of any kind of introductory guidance when the UCO joined the unit?
I can't answer that because certainly the period I recall with Mike Ferguson, because of his experience, he did most of the briefing for new officers.
Thank you. Sexual liaisons. In your witness statement, you say that you considered that a sexual liaison with any individual whilst on duty would have been contrary to police regulations. What police regulations do you have in mind there? Are those police regulations that cover discipline?
Yes.
So bringing discredit on the reputation of the force?
Absolutely.
And were all the officers in the SDS during your time aware that any sexual liaison in their undercover role would come under those police regulations?
Well, certainly all the officers I spoke to were aware of that.
You also say in your witness statement you didn't give specific guidance to officers about sexual contact, other than a reminder of the police regulations and the guidance for all serving officers was that it would be an offence under the police regulations to have a sexual liaison on duty. Was that something that you told officers in terms?
I can't honestly say whether I told everyone that. I must admit that I've, being rather old-fashioned, presumed that people knew the police regulations, particularly all those officers I would think had 5 years police service or even more, well, a lot more. And those were the rules throughout the time. So, no, I most probably didn't specifically say, now look here, chaps, or whoever, remember police regulations don't have sexual relationships.
We know that during the course of your service with the SDS, at least 8 officers were deployed undercover. I'm not going to, you may want to refer to the, have you got a list in front of you? I'm not going to ask you for any names, I just want to, so that you're aware of who I'm speaking about. HN 304, HN 354, HN 80, HN 126.
Pause a moment. He's,
sorry.
You're having a look.
So sorry. I'm so sorry. That's
more slowly.
my fault entirely. My fault entirely. So sorry.
Start again.
HN 304, I think, was deployed undercover during your period.
Yes.
HN 354 in January 1977, he was deployed.
Oh, yes.
HN 80.
Yes.
HN 126.
Yes.
HN 356.
Oh, yes, yes.
HN 96.
Sorry, I didn't get the
96.
Oh, 96, I beg your pardon. Oh, yes, yes,
HN 106.
yes,
And HN 155.
yes.
Of those, we know that HN 354, that we now know was Vince Harvey,
Right, yes.
had sexual relations with 4 women in his undercover role, and HN 155 may have done so. You say in your witness statement that you weren't, because you weren't aware of any officer having sexual contact with any person whilst operating undercover, you had no reason to think that the guidance needed to be made stronger or expressed any differently. HN 354 has told this inquiry that stricter guidance would have caused him to make different decisions. Whatever guidance you gave about sexual contact undercover, do you accept it was not particularly strict?
No, I don't suspect that at all. I was quite, well, always have been, strong on police discipline. And I would have thought that if they were having a problem with this particular aspect, they would approach either myself or the DCI to discuss the problem and the way forward.
Thank you. We're going to come on to talk about that in a moment. just dealing with other aspects of guidance to undercover officers. The Commission of Criminal Offences, you say that you gave advice that the Commission of Criminal Offences was not permitted, and it was made abundantly clear that undercover officers should not indulge in criminal activity, excluding peaceful protests, activities such as bill posting or leafleting. Can you recall when advice of that nature was given to undercover officers? Would that have been at the beginning of their deployment or ad hoc during the course of their deployment?
Throughout their employment.
Was that advice formal or informal? Can you remember?
Can you sort of enlarge on what you term as formal and informal?
Well, was this a question of sitting the officers down in a room and sort of delivering an edict, as it were, from management figures, or was it simply something that came up during conversations with them during the course of their deployments?
Initially, they would have been given that advice. Although I didn't do it, I'm quite sure that Mike Ferguson would have done. But the informal stuff would be normally at a meeting or not necessarily a group meeting, but we used to meet them individually, and that was the opportunity to actually seek any problems they were facing and also to advise them on the way forward.
Thank you. Can I very briefly, please, have on the screen UCPI 50288810? This is a security services note for file about a meeting that you attended with Mike Ferguson and Trevor Butler right at the end of your time with the SDS. And can we just please go to the second page of this document and to paragraph 3 at the bottom, please. You say, it says there, in general conversation, we touched on the problem of agents being involved in actions of varying degrees of illegality. Ferguson remarked that certainly for the more trivial offences, there was no real hindrance to their operation, since they were often able to insulate their sources, even though this sometimes meant not prosecuting other offenders. You were asked about that, and your response was you had no idea if that was an approach or an opinion prevalent with others in the SDS. Is that right? And beyond?
All I can say at the moment is I believe that's the first time I've ever seen that paragraph.
I believe you commented on your witness statement, but it's perhaps of no great moment because you say that you don't recall that being said in your witness statement, and you've got no idea whether others felt as Mike Ferguson felt, whether that was a view prevalent. You say that your approach was that you would not authorise any conduct beyond peaceful protest. Is that right?
Yes, and leafleting, I think you mentioned, yes.
Thank you. We can take that document down now, please.
So you would have drawn the line at bill posting?
Not necessarily, sir. It would depend on the circumstances the officer found them in. But no, I would say I would most probably would say bill posting was all right.
Positions of responsibility, you say in your statement no specific guidance was given about officers taking on positions of responsibility. No permission was required, but there would have been a discussion between the undercover officer and their management, you and Mike Smith, is that right? And you say that there was some benefit to a UCO taking on a position of responsibility within their target group because it's enhanced intelligence gathering. Can you recall whether Mike Ferguson expressed views on undercover officers taking on active roles in groups? Was that something that he actively encouraged? Can you recall?
Well, certainly it wouldn't have been discouraged if it was a role like treasurer or something. But if it was a role which obviously involved future activities, conspiracy or whatever, we wouldn't advise them. In fact, we would go against them going into that.
Thank you very much. Prior to your joining the SDS, you say in your witness statement you had a very limited understanding of it or what its purpose was or what it did.
Absolutely true, yes.
When you joined the SDS, was there any sort of briefing you were given about what its purpose was and what its methods were? Or was it simply the informal guidance you were given by Mike Ferguson again?
Or Geoffrey Craft, you tell me.
Or Geoffrey Craft?
Yes.
You say that the role of the SDS in your witness statement was to supply information to the agency or agencies who'd asked for information or assistance, and this included A8 and the security services, although it's certainly possible other parts of Special Branch asked the SDS for intelligence. Did you understand there to be any sort of limit on the types of intelligence that were gathered?
No, the answer has to be no, in as much as when you're dealing with intelligence, you have to group in as much as you can to ascertain whether or not the intelligence, the overall intelligence, is valid or not. So I'd say no, there wasn't any boundaries.
Was it simply a question of hoovering everything up and passing it on for assessment by others? Was that the approach that was taken, do you believe?
Well, to some extent, I suppose it was. But then it's difficult to know exactly what is going to be useful in due course.
When you say to some extent, do you mean that there might have been some sort of filtering of information, or you don't know?
Well, no. The end result would be the organisation which wanted the information, not the SDS.
Thank you. Did you understand the purposes of the gathering of the intelligence, or were you told by the, for want of a better word, customers of the SDS what the purpose was?
No, not specifically. It was all part of your special branch training. You knew roughly what's going to happen to it and why it was being collected.
And would the undercover officers have had a similar understanding of the purposes, that there was something that they knew from their special branch training in a general sort of way, do you think?
Absolutely. I'm not aware of undercover officers being inexperienced SB officers. There might have been, but
You say that you didn't make any decisions on targeting or tasking. Those were made by other police and government departments.
that's true.
Dealing with the police departments first, which squads did you understand were making decisions on targeting or tasking for the SDS?
If it was internal, the very senior management of the sections concerned.
And so we're talking S squad, C squad.
Yes.
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 So those are the squads
chief
we're talking about.
superintendent.
And it's at that rank, chief superintendents are making those decisions.
Well, he had the overall responsibility for those decisions.
By government departments, do you mean the security services?
I do.
And the Home Office, were they making decisions on targets or tasking that you recall?
Certainly, I'm not aware of it.
The targeting or tasking that came into the SDS, was that written instruction? Did you receive written instructions about targeting and tasking?
I can't recall. I should think it was a mixture. If it was internal, it would be on some document.
Right. But was it also delivered to you verbally?
Possible before demonstrations or something.
And that would come from A8, would it?
No, I don't recall ever being given a target from A8.
Right.
We fed them. They didn't feed us.
Right. Thank you. I might ask you about that a little bit more in a moment. A number of officers deployed into the SWP during your time at the SDS. We know, for example, that HN 354 went into the Walthamstow branch of the SWP. Does the fact that he infiltrated the Walthamstow branch indicate anything of any particular significance about that branch, or was it simply that there was a geographical spread of SW deployments around London? Can you recall?
Yes, it would be the latter reason.
So just a geographical spread.
Yes.
The extreme right wing, you say in your witness statement that it was not infiltrated, but that the SDS had it in mind that it might be in due course. And you say that your recollection was that this was a high-level policy decision, but I was too junior to be part of that. Can you assist us with why there was a high-level policy decision in the 70s not to infiltrate the extreme right wing?
Not really. I had ideas. It was a very violent section, and it was often involved in crime. So to put an undercover officer into that would be very, very, very difficult. Also, it was felt that a lot of information about the right-wing activities was actually available through the left wing, because they were particularly interested in what the right wing were doing.
Right. Thank you. Specific tasking requests. In your witness statement, you deal with the channels through which specific requests for intelligence were communicated, and you said they would come through internal channels via senior officers, then into the SDS, and you would act accordingly. And by internal channels, you mean a senior SDS officer or in exceptional circumstances to you. Requests from the security services, you say received by at least a superintendent. Superintendent in which squad? Do you mean in S squad?
No, I'm not. I can't recall any requests from the security service going direct to us in SDS. If there was direct an immediate request, it would have gone through the squad concerned. So most of our business was with C squad, so I'd expect it to come through the superintendent of C squad.
And how was that information then fed into the SDS? So the superintendent of C squad receives the tasking from the security services, and then how was that fed into the SDS?
I suspect verbally, and it would be noted on the minute sheet that so-and-so was informed and action was taken.
And to whom would that request come? To you or to Mike Ferguson or to both of you?
Whoever was there, yes.
Right. Can you recall how frequently the security services sent in requests for tasking requests?
Specific one? I can't, no.
Was it sort of a number of times a week or
I really can't
months
tell
apart?
because they dealt with C squad chief superintendent, not with SDS. I mean,
Right.
we were cut off really.
Were you aware when you received tasking requests of who the ultimate customer was? If it came through that channel, through C squad, would you have known whether that was a C squad request or a security service request?
Most probably, yes.
Right. Requests from other police departments. What was the route into the SDS, please? So, for example, if you had a request from C Squad, so it's a police request. What rank of officer would be doing the requesting? Would that be the superintendent also?
You say police requests, what, outside special branch?
No,
or-
sorry, I mean special branch requests. Would that be the rank of superintendent that would make the tasking
Certainly,
request?
or even the chief.
And thereafter, did it follow the same pattern that it would be communicated to either to you or to Mike Ferguson, verbally or written?
Well, we had meetings with our own superintendent and every day, and chief superintendent, and those sort of things would be discussed. And I should think nearly all of them were verbal, because we're talking in general about where we can locate our officers rather than dealing with a specific request. So there'll be general discussions on what's going on, what is the flavour of the month, and take it from there. So a lot of it wouldn't be a formal minute from the superintendent.
You had daily meetings, you say, with your superintendents. That's the superintendents of S Squad, is it?
Yes.
And during those daily meetings, tasking requests and things of that nature were discussed between you, is that right?
Oh, absolutely.
And you say that there would be a conversation about what was the flavour of the month and how to service those requests, is that right?
Whether we could or not, yes.
Does it follow that there was a discretion to decline a tasking request at the SDS level if you weren't able to
Oh,
service
absolutely.
it?
And very often we didn't have anyone who could help in that situation.
A8 and the uniform public order unit, you say you didn't receive tasking requests from them, is that right?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
but you supplied information to A8.
Yes, but via the squad.
Right.
So it went to C squad normally.
Right. Thank you. And was that about specific events that you, the
Yes.
sort of information you supplied
I mean,
to them?
occasionally we would have direct contact with A8 if we got information about numbers for a particular demonstration in the immediate future. In other words, it had to be quickly communicated so that the local police or whatever could be prepared for the situation.
And that was that. Did you use the telephone for communicating that sort of thing?
Yes, it would be done by phone.
Right. Thank you. Overall SDS supervision. You had the daily meetings with your superintendent that took place in the SDS office. Is that right? They would come to you. And you say that was to discuss problems or progress. How long did those meetings typically last? Can you recall?
It would depend on what was happening. I mean, a lot of the conversation would be generalities because you're always looking to the future. Targeting was never done instantly. It had to be plotted and planned. And the feasibility had to be examined. So in these daily conversations, it would cover all sorts of topics, subjects.
You, during the course of those meetings, did you provide feedback about the activities of the UCOs in the STS to the superintendent?
Only if it was significant.
Right.
I mean, it's not a daily report saying, Joe blogs us very well, thank you.
Right. And if there was something significant, would that be likely to be an oral a report, or would you put that into writing?
It'd be a discussion initially,
Yes.
and if it was something serious, it would be put on paper.
If there were difficulties encountered with an undercover officer, were you required to run that by the senior managers, the superintendents?
No.
No. So that was something you could deal with internally.
True.
A progress report. You said you discussed problems or progress. What do you mean by progress?
I'm not sure what I meant. Can you?
Well, what you say is, let me just find the paragraph and I'll read it to you. It's your paragraph 102. The superintendent and or the chief superintendent will be in the SDS office daily to see me and or the detective chief inspector to discuss problems or progress.
Exactly what I've just said to you. We have discussed the current situation and into the future.
Right. Thank you very much. Would you have characterised SDS supervision by your superintendent as close supervision or not?
As far as the direction the squad was concerned, yes, I would say it was close, but actually on day-to-day dealings with the individuals, no, it wasn't.
Okay.
That was down to the chief inspector and myself.
Right. Thank you. Authorisations from senior managers. I want to just talk about the limits of your sort of your autonomy. If a UCO was to be withdrawn from the field, did that require the authorisation of any senior manager outside the SDS?
Well, it would do. Well, the process would go through senior management.
Right.
The actual the reasons may not be given to senior management in full,
Right.
because there was a very strong need to know policy during my time.
So that SDS could make the decision, but the process that had to be followed then had to be sent up the chain. Is that how I understood that right?
Because SDS was part of S-Squad, and S-Squad had a superintendent and also a chief superintendent. So it would go via them.
How about recruitment of a new undercover officer? Would that have required authorisation from senior managers?
Well, yes, to get a posting to a different squad, it had to go through a process.
How about the deployment direction of a new UCO? I just want to understand what influence the SDS may have had on where an officer was deployed. We know, for example, that HN 96 began his service during your time at the SDS in October 1978, and he was deployed into the SWP, and he's said to have been replacing another officer who was being withdrawn from the SWP. That sort of deployment decision, where somebody is replacing another officer, is that the sort of deployment decision which would have required any sort of sign-off by senior management, or is that something that you would have had the autonomy to do yourselves?
Senior management would know that so-and-so is going into a particular area. And that would have been discussed, as I said, in our daily meetings. No, they would accept the advice of the chief inspector.
HN 106, in case you just need to, can you remember who he is? Don't say the name, but I just want you to
Yes.
recollect who he was. He says in his witness statement he wasn't directed to any particular group, but was told to focus generally on the far left and find another group other than the SWP which was worth targeting. Was that an instruction that would have been simply issued by SDS managers, or would that have come further up the chain?
No.
Okay.
That would be us.
Thank you. Travelling outside the Metropolitan Police area, we know that you travelled with Detective Sergeant Richard Walker to Blackburn to accompany 4 SDS officers to a demonstration there. Is that the sort of thing that would have required authorisation by senior managers?
Oh, very much so, because the Chief Constable of the force concerned would have to be informed.
Whilst we're on this topic, I just want to ask you just a couple of questions about it. Can we have up on the screen, please, MPS 0730728? The initial note from Geoffrey Craft said at least 4 of our SDS field officers under heavy pressure from their organisation to take part in demonstration in Blackburn, and refusal on their part would undoubtedly put their cover at risk. It's proposed, therefore, that they be instructed to join their colleagues in the day's activity, and that DI McIntosh and DS Walker travel to Blackburn on the Saturday morning to be on hand should any difficulty arise. The purpose of your travelling to Blackburn appears to be to safeguard those officers so that you could step in should any difficulty come up during the course of that demonstration. Is that right?
That's correct.
What would local police be told about your presence, or would they be told anything at all about your presence there?
Well, As I say, the Chief Constable or his deputy would have been informed, and we liaised with their special branch. Blackburn would be Lancashire, hasn't it?
Right. You can take that down now, please. And can we have up on the screen MPS 0730729? This is a letter of thanks from the Lancashire Police Headquarters. The second paragraph, the demonstration was concluded without any serious incident, and the assistance of your Detective Inspector McIntosh and Detective Sergeant Walker is very much appreciated. What sort of assistance would you have given to the...
Well, that, in my mind, is just a very polite letter. In fact, our presence was sitting in an office, hoping that the right wing hadn't attacked the left wing and injured any of our officers.
Right.
And that was basically it.
Right. So that looks as if it's simply a form of words that's used to acknowledge your presence.
Yes.
Thank you very much. You can take that down. Recruitment. You say that you were involved in the recruitment of undercover officers, and you list the particular qualities you were looking for when you made that decision. You say that you had a preference for stable, reliable, mentally relaxed and dependable UCOs, amateur dramatic enthusiasts, because essentially you were asking them to be actors in their role. Recommendations, you said, would often come through the back office, sergeants, is it through people that they had known during the course of their previous police career in the special branch?
Yes. I expect and understand it most probably came through at that level, because they are officers who actually knew the new officers. Whereas, I'd been in special branch something like 12 years by the time I was a DI, and I didn't know many of the individuals, particularly as part of my time had been away from London anyhow.
And did you, once you received a name or a tip-off about somebody who might be a suitable candidate, did you then ask around about that person generally in special branch?
Yes, we did.
You say in your witness statement you would have asked their superior officers about them. Did you also speak to their contemporaries?
No, we couldn't really. If they're contemporaries, you've got to... The problem is in special branches, or was, it was a very small department. And therefore you had lots of little cliques. And to find out about a particular individual, anything of real value, you couldn't afford to go into that clique because it wouldn't be a good assessment. Whereas the other officers in the back office could, because they knew colleagues of that era.
So that was something that was sort of informally delegated, was it?
Oh, absolutely.
The back office
because in general, in special branch at that time, no one outside SDS knew what exactly they were doing. They knew that people disappeared for a number of years, and on very odd occasions were brought into the yard because they had to be seen in the yard, and they all were very scruffy.
I think you say in your witness statement that special branch was like a family. You repeated it sort of a small...
As I say, yes.
Was it... did reputation sort of travel round special branch? You could find out about somebody's reputation relatively easily?
Well, to some extent, but it depends on the individual and how prepared they are to talk about their private lives.
Yeah.
So you only got a reputation, maybe, as seen from a professional eye.
If we've heard that various officers had reputations in Special Branch for being womanizers, is that the sort of reputation which would have affected your view as to their suitability during your inquiries?
It would, but it would depend exactly what the reputation, the basis of the reputation. I mean, to be quite frank, there was a lot of banter. It's a band of men, or it was in those days. And in any institution where it's all male, there is always banter. And I dare say there may be similar banter amongst women. I don't know. And where you got banter, you often had people, rather like the social media, saying things, in fact, they hadn't done or wouldn't do, but were keeping in with the crowd. So you had to be very careful making an assessment purely on banter.
So that wasn't necessarily something that you would have taken terribly seriously?
Well, in one way we would, because you don't want an individual who you knew was likely to behave in such a manner in close contact with women. Yes, it would be an important feature.
HN 155, and if you need to refer to the list that you've got, then
I think
then
I
do.
know
Thank
who
you.
you're talking about.
He describes Mike Ferguson firing questions at him prior to his deployment to ensure that he was prepared for it.
Yes.
Was that something common? Did Mike Ferguson tend to do that with UCOs when they first started?
Jeff Craft as well. I mean, that was part of the job, was to make sure they're prepared to go out and test their cover story and all the aspects with it, yes.
And would that have touched on, do you think, the risk of engaging in any sort of sexual relationship?
I've no idea.
No idea.
I mean, he was an experienced field officer at one time.
A major factor in their suitability, you say in your witness statement, was the marital status of the undercover officer or potential undercover officer, because there was an appreciation that undercover life was a difficult one and domestic stability was very important. You say that you always spoke to the spouse or the partner of an undercover officer to assess how acceptable a new way of life would be in respect of their domestic life. How would you assess that?
Well, we spoke on the occasions we did meet the officer's wife. It was prior to them going out, so one of the main purposes of these meetings was actually to introduce ourselves to the lady, make it abundantly clear that we were available at all times should they have any problem. And that was the main objective of meeting.
How would you assess whether the pressured and difficult role of the UCO would be one that their domestic life could withstand?
You couldn't really. You had to accept what the good lady was saying to you. I mean, you can only inquire about domestic situations. We certainly didn't investigate them.
What did you say to the the spouse or the partner about the life that their partner was going to undertake? What were you able to say to them about it?
Well, basically that they would be working long hours, and a lot of it would be evening work, and you wouldn't be seeing your husband for very long periods.
So it was largely about the absences from the
Yes,
domestic house.
general welfare, really. A, acquainting them with what the circumstances may involve, and B, to reassure them that they had two numbers, two officers to approach, and hopefully we came over as understanding, caring individuals to give them confidence to contact us.
And did you give them any sort of indication of the sorts of risks that there might be involved
No.
in their husband's deployments?
No.
And did you assist them with how to raise a concern if they were worried about something with their husbands and the sorts of things that might have been of concern?
Other than introducing ourselves and saying we were open 24 hours a day for any problem.
You say in your witness statement you wanted to gain their trust. What was the purpose of that for you?
Whose trust?
The spouse. You wanted to gain the trust of the spouse.
Yes.
What was the purpose of gaining their trust?
As I said, welfare reasons. If they had problems, they could contact us and we could sort it out.
You also say that a stable domestic life or their marital, it was likely to reduce the temptations of any sexual liaison whilst undercover. Was that a reason, one of the other reasons why you would have a preference for a married officer?
Absolutely.
So the temptation of a sexual liaison undercover was a risk that was actively considered. Is that right?
Of course, facts of life.
Was that explained to the undercover officer or to their spouse when they were recruited, that anxiety?
Certainly not to the spouse. We wouldn't say to her, you realise that there's an opportunity that he might have a sexual relationship. No.
Did you have any ongoing contact with the spouse during the course of the undercover officer's deployment?
I can't recall it.
So it wasn't a question of checking in with them occasionally?
Oh, far from not. No, definitely not.
Simply that they could phone you were
Yep.
anything to arise?
Open door policy.
We understand that HN 354, Vince Harvey's
Yes.
long-standing relationship broke down during the course of his deployment. Was that something that you or Mike Ferguson were aware of?
I can't speak for Mike Ferguson, but I certainly wasn't. And in fact, when I learned of this inquiry and his behaviour, I was amazed.
If you had learnt of that, would that have concerned you that he was a single man?
Oh,
under UCM?
absolutely, absolutely. Security risk.
And what would you have done about it, do you think?
Well, I would have expected the Chief Inspector to have him withdrawn, and the matter certainly would have been taken up to the Chief Superintendent level,
Right,
without a doubt.
right. Thank you very much. So I wonder if that's a suitable moment at which to have a break.
Certainly it would be. We will now have a quarter of an hour's break. If at any stage, while you're giving evidence, which is quite a long process, you want a further break, all you have to do is to say so, and we will
Thank you
accommodate
very
it.
much.
We'll adjourn for 15 minutes.
All rise, please.
Mr. McIntosh, can I just take you back to your last answer, because I don't want there to be any confusion about it. HN354 Vince Harvey, we understand, his relationship broke down at during the course of his deployment. And you said you didn't have any idea of that, the relationship breakdown. I then asked if you had known about the relationship breakdown, would that have concerned you? I wonder if you could just revisit your answer.
Yes, I should make it clear. I was referring to his relationship whilst out in the field.
That's what I want.
Previous.
That's what I wanted to clarify with you. So can we just go back over that, please? Had you known about the relationship, his long-term relationship breakdown, as when he was deployed, would that in and of itself been something that concerned you?
It would have done, but well, it certainly would have done, because I firmly believed it was better to recruit married men, and Vince Harvey was a single man. But
sorry.
Someone considered that he would be an exception.
Had you known about the breakdown of that relationship, would it have what would you have done about it?
I'm not certain. It's hard to go back to some extent. I'd most probably have looked at it from a welfare point of view completely, because it was nothing to do, indirectly it was to do with most probably his working duties. On the other hand, it was purely a domestic matter, and it was too late to withdraw him from the field because he wasn't married. No, I would only have dealt with it as a welfare matter to see if I could assist either party.
Was the fact that he was not married and single, albeit in a long-term relationship, something that concerned you when he was coming into the unit?
Yes, but, because I personally thought married men were a better risk.
And was that something that you expressed openly, your reservations?
Oh, it wouldn't have been a secret, particularly with my chief inspector, because it's general chit-chat, you know, no secrets professionally.
Thank you. Moving on now, please, to cover identities. You said that you did not have any role in the inventing, developing or assessing of cover identities, but you did have an advisory role in the building of cover identities. What do you mean by advisory? Can you recall?
Well, I certainly believed in the system of getting the birth certificates of very young children who had died.
And why did you believe in that system?
Why? Well, I'd heard of the system. It wasn't a secret system at all. It was in the public eye. If you read books and stuff like that. It seemed a good system from the point of view, it gave them a definite date of birth and a birth certificate for the casual look. Nothing was computerized in those days. I didn't think it had, well, and I've been proved wrong, but I didn't think it had any risk of exposure. The chances were so long that to me it wasn't a risk, and therefore I didn't think it could cause any embarrassment to the deceased parents' relatives.
Does it follow that at the time you didn't consider any ethical implications of using the identity of
No,
a child who had died.
No.
Can you recall any active consideration of the ethics of that
No, none
tactic? Of course, the families are now aware that the identities of their children have been used. Does it cause you now to question the ethics of using that tactic?
No, I don't go back at all on my views. I think it's most unfortunate that this inquiry has enabled the poor families and relatives to realise that this has happened. In normal circumstances, it wouldn't have happened. I mean, it's extraordinary.
HN 80, in his witness statement, he said that using the full details of a real child caused him distress, and so whilst he did obtain a birth certificate of a real child, he changed the first name. Were you aware of that?
No, can I see who the person was?
Yes, HN80, sorry, yes, of course.
Yeah, I
No.
certainly wasn't aware of that.
Thank you. HN297, Rick Clark, whose name is open. Your period of deployment overlapped with him for a certain period. I think he came out in September 1976. Can you recall him being withdrawn from the SDS?
No, I can't actually, and I don't know why, because it's an event of great significance operationally. I do recall being present outside the pub with the surveillance team and that, because we knew that this particular officer had been uncovered.
So you think...
And
gosh,
whoops,
sorry.
It's my foot.
Sorry.
And we feared that as a result, this follow-up meeting, there could be violence or whatever. And that's all I knew. I didn't know any details of it, so I presumed that Jeff Craft had dealt with it with another backroom staff, which accounts, as I said at the beginning of my interview, I don't recall working with Jeff.
Yeah. But you were aware of a potential compromise in Rick Clark's case.
Absolutely, yes.
And were you aware that that potential compromise was the birth and the death certificate that he was presented with?
I'm not sure whether I was, but I'm certainly aware now.
Did that, as you understood it, potential compromise prompt any kind of review or rethinking of the practice of using the identities of children who'd died that you can recall?
As I say, I don't recall it, but I'm sure it did. And particularly how it occurred. I mean, what were the circumstances? We did know that there were certain organisations which had very severe security checks, hence the reason why for all undercover officers we had strong background stories. How or why the organisation felt or knew, I don't know, but to be able to do that, they must have gone up to Somerset House or St Catherine's House, whichever was holding the records, and done all the searches to prove this. So very strange in my mind. So in answer to your question, without doubt, we would have been very concerned and looked at the whole practice as to the way forward.
But it's not something, his compromise was not something that you think you were told about?
I'm sure. I wasn't told about it, other than he had been exposed.
I'll deal with it now because we're dealing with 297. One of the officers, undercover officers, indicates that he had heard from Rick Clark that the reason for his compromise was his sexual dalliances. Did you hear anything like that, or were you aware of anything like that?
I didn't. I wasn't aware of his dalliances.
Right. I'll deal with that a little later in a bit more detail. Supervision of the undercover officers. You describe.
For interrupting them.
So
If you're
sorry.
moving from the exposure of Rick Clark, HN 297, there's a question I would like to ask at
please
this
do.
stage. You remember going to a pub and, in effect, performing a surveillance and, if necessary, protection role for Rick Clark, who was inside the pub.
Yes, meeting
Yeah. And
colleagues.
you understood him to be meeting people who were going to confront him.
Well, I'll take the issue on. Presumably, he had been confronted at some time. Otherwise, we wouldn't have known he had been exposed.
Right. So you knew he'd been exposed.
No, I'm sorry, Chairman. I'm saying that we wouldn't be keeping surveillance on this meeting unless we knew that he had been exposed.
Yes.
And because of that, we feared for his safety.
So you did know he'd been exposed.
Yes, I've been told that.
By members of a group or one of the groups that he'd infiltrated?
I'm sorry, I was told that presumably by a member of the office,
Yeah.
not by the group.
No, of course not. But he had been exposed by someone in a group that he had something to
I
do
beg
with.
your pardon,
Yes.
absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Did you attend outside the pub alone or with other people?
No, there were several of us, including members of the surveillance, the Special Branch surveillance
Yeah.
team.
Anyone else from the SDS?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
We
Well,
would-
other than the chief inspector or maybe someone in the back office.
So your recollection is that the chief inspector or someone in the back office was with
Well,
you?
someone told me that this meeting was going to take place, and it was decided because we feared that the officer was in danger or could be in danger,
Yeah.
that surveillance and our presence was around there.
Right. Yesterday, I was told by Jeff Craft that he had been outside the pub with Derek Neal.
Well, I can't comment on that, sir,
No.
because I don't recall, I personally don't recall being out on an operation with Derek Neal.
No.
He was the superintendent, I think, at the time.
It may be that the truth, although neither of you remember it, is that you and Jeff Craft were there.
If you had asked earlier on, sir, that would have been my answer.
Right.
Yes.
So as best as you can remember,
Best I can remember.
it was you and Jeff Craft.
Yes, I certainly can't recall being out with the superintendent.
Yes.
Your primary concern as the DI at the STS was that you say the morale and safety of the individual officers and their day-to-day running and welfare. And I just want to explore what that meant in practice and how closely officers were monitored or supervised. You say in your witness statement you had weekly meetings. We've heard, in fact, they were twice weekly meetings. Is that right?
Yes.
And also there were there daily telephone conversations from the officers?
They phoned in every day, yes.
I just want to deal with the telephone conversations first. What was their purpose? What was the reason for the daily telephone conversation?
To know they were still with us.
Right. So it was there was an update on their. It was a welfare check, was it?
Well, it's a mixture of, in the police force, we used to have to check in every day and check off every day. In these circumstances, they didn't phone to check off because of their job.
Over the telephone call, would you receive an update on the daily activity of the undercover officer or not?
No, not necessarily.
And would you ask them for any sort of progress report about what they've been doing? Or
No. I'd be interested in their welfare, that they were okay and everything was ticking over.
And so the day-to-day, their day-to-day activities, would you have been aware of them, where they were going, what they were doing?
Not in detail, no.
The twice weekly meetings, those took place at the Safe House, we understand. Yeah. And those were meetings that you attended with Mike Ferguson,
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Did you meet all the officers together at some stage?
Yes, no, the safe houses had more than one room, and very often Mike Ferguson would go into the room where all the officers were writing up their notes or doing whatever, and I'd be in a separate room because we had to keep diaries, we had to vet their expenses and stuff like that. So I would be doing that side of the job. And Mike Ferguson would normally be there for general chat or taking individuals aside to deal with whatever was current.
Were you present during the general chat that you can recall?
Very, very seldom. Very seldom.
So you were dealing with the sort of admin paperwork, were
Yep.
you, in a
Yes.
side room? Mike Ferguson would be in the main sitting area with the officers.
Yes, he'd be in and out according to the day's requirements.
You also, or Mike Ferguson spoke to them individually. Did you speak to them individually?
On occasions, yes.
And during those individual conversations, did you take an account of their activities, what they've been doing over the past few days since you'd last had a face-to-face meeting with them?
Yes, it would normally daytime be looking after their cover story, in other words, place of work and activities and that, and then their involvement at other times in the evenings.
And would they tell you then which demonstrations they've been to or which meetings they've been to, or matters of that nature?
Yeah, they would report. Actually, they would draft it out, and the draft would be turned into a report.
And so at those meetings, they had already drafted, had they?
Well, it depended on the individual. Some had already done it, others did it during the meeting or aside of the meeting.
And you took their notes or their reports from them, did you, to process back in the back office?
They were collected, yep.
Was it at the Safe House during these meetings that individual officers were given their tasking? If a request had come in for a particular brand of intelligence or intelligence on a particular group
Yes,
or event?
It would be done, they would be given it at the Safe House.
And would that be a verbal instruction from you, verbal?
Yes, it would.
And both you and Mike Ferguson involved in that process, or just Mike
Mainly
Ferguson?
Mike.
Would you and Mike Ferguson have had a general awareness of the day-to-day activities of the undercover officers that you were looking after?
Well, only a general. We didn't go out spying on them.
Overtime claims, is that something that you had to deal with?
Yes.
From their overtime claims, could you have built up an idea of the hours that officers were working?
Oh, yes.
And was lengthy hours, if someone's working lengthy hours, would that have been of some concern?
Well, it was concern for two reasons. One was welfare, and the other reason was the cost.
Right. HN354 has, I think, told us that he was working 7 days a week, 14 hours a day, and rarely took a day off. Would you have offered any sort of words of advice about those sorts of lengthy hours to the officer concerned?
Well,
can you recall?
constantly, because there was tremendous pressure at the time from Scotland Yard as a whole on overtime, and so the pressure was passed down through the management line, and everyone was required to try and curtail overtime. This particular job, it was virtually impossible to curtail it.
So the sort of overarching management concern was the money, but your concern was also the welfare of the officers, is that right?
Oh, absolutely right. And I have to stress that there was tremendous pressure from outside to reduce it because of the cost. And in my mind, it didn't consider the job being done. But personally, I was very concerned of the long hours. But I couldn't see a way of actually reducing it without jeopardising their cover.
What were your concerns about them working long hours? What sort of welfare concerns did you have?
It meant that they weren't ever getting home and being with their wives and children.
Was there any concern that they were becoming too close to their individuals in their target group? Was that something that occurred to you?
No, it wasn't one voiced, I have to say. There's always a risk of that, and it's very hard to actually control, because if you're not there or got witness of what people are doing, it's very hard to actually say, other than where's the evidence that they're not doing what they say they're doing.
Did you build up a close relationship with the officers in the STS during your time there?
I like to feel that I did.
And did you feel the relationship was such that it would encourage any disclosure of any concerns they might have had, the officers, to you? Was it that sort of relationship they could discuss problems that they had?
It was, but we have to acknowledge that some of the problems they might have, which may have been self-induced, they wouldn't tell a senior officer. I mean, although they're undercover officers, they are police officers. And there is, or was then, a very strict discipline and respect for rank. And the SDS was exceptional. I say exceptional, but maybe Special Branch was different to the main police force. But outside, you never refer to anyone of rank above you by their first name. In the SDS, that rule wasn't enforced because we wanted to gain their confidence so that we would be told what any problem was. But if I wouldn't expect them to say, I'm having a problem, I'm sleeping with a member of the group.
That was not something you would have expected them to say to you?
Certainly not, because I think they would feel, and I would agree with them in principle, it could jeopardise their whole career.
How about Mike Ferguson? Was he the sort? Did he build up a close relationship with?
Oh, he did exactly the same. Yes.
And was he the sort of man who could be confided in about difficulties that were being encountered, with the caveat that sexual relationships you think were off the table?
I have absolutely no doubt about that. He was a man's man.
Thank you. And did they come to you with problems, the undercover officers, that you can recall? I don't need to know the details of them, but...
Well, yes. But I have to say, I don't remember many domestic problems.
It's clear from your witness statement that you were aware of the risk that undercover officers might engage in sexual contact in their undercover identities, and one of the steps you took to mitigate that risk was the preference for officers that were married. Would that be fair?
That would be fair, yes.
Was that risk, was that a serious concern for the SDS, do you think?
Yes, but from the security angle of the whole operation.
That was going to be my next question. Why was it considered to be a serious risk?
Why?
Yes.
Because if you've got that close sort of relationship, you might let slip something. And I guess, you having said that Rick Clark had been involved with women, that most probably was how it came out. I don't know.
So it was the anxiety for the SDS, you say, was that this could jeopardise the operation, a
the
sexual
whole
relationship.
security of the operation.
Did you also consider that an officer engaging in sexual activity in those circumstances was abusing his position and his power at that time?
Not at all, no. I would have viewed it as, if you take away the discipline side, of something which is between male and female, or whatever sex, and things happen. And the mental track of that is down to the individual.
You say in your witness statement that there were discussions about the issue of girlfriends for these undercover officers who were posing as single men in their target groups, because it made it difficult for them when dealing with female members of their group. Was that something that the undercover officers brought up with you at the safe house? Can you remember?
Oh, yes, yes.
And was that something that Mike Ferguson would also have been aware of? Were other officers present?
Yes, yes.
And was that something that was shared outside the SDS with any going into superintendent
It would have gone
ranks?
to higher level because we were looking for ways of solving the problem. But it was felt impractical to, yes, operationally impractical.
Thank you.
Bring in our own.
Thank you. Risk factors. That may have increased the risk of sexual activity being undertaken. We've mentioned also the long hours work. Was alcohol, we mentioned also alcohol. Personal relationship with activists, was that considered to be a risk factor when we're trying to identify when people might succumb to a sexual relationship, if they were building up close relationships with members of their target group?
Well, it's difficult to answer because we're talking about human relations. Yes, there is a risk. There's a risk of this sort of behaviour in any circumstances, in any large group, institution, whatever.
And was that something that you tried to monitor through your conversations with the undercover officers?
We tried to sense that, but it's not something they would talk about, to be quite honest.
And how about social activities that they might be undertaking with members of their target group? Was that something that you tried to get a sense of through your conversations with the undercover officers in the safe house?
Well, not from a sexual point of view, no. The participation in social activities was all necessary as part of their cover. I mean, very strange to have a member who doesn't partake in all the functions of the organisation.
And how about the period of time that an undercover officer was deployed? You say in your witness statement there was a 4-year maximum during your period, and was that something you felt quite strongly about, that it should be 4 years?
I know it's 4 years, but that includes the period in the back office, learning the art, etc. And I used to think 3 years was maximum. But of course there are always circumstances and pressures one way or the other where rules are bent, I guess.
And you say in your witness statement that that would avoid, that absolute maximum would avoid the possibility of officers going rogue. What did you mean by going rogue?
Well, forgetting that they are actually police officers and therefore not acting as they should do.
And did you mean engaging in sexual activity with?
I meant across the board.
Thank you. In his evidence, HN 354, Vince Harvey told us that he spoke to, he thought, Jeff Craft about an activist who'd expressed a sexual interest in him and asked his advice as to how to respond to that. Was that something that you were aware of?
No, certainly not.
Did you consider that there might have been incentives for undercover officers to engage in sexual activity, for example, to enhance their cover, that might have been a difficulty?
Definitely not. None at all.
Did you believe it would have enhanced their cover or not?
It would in practice, but we would never recommend that or encourage it.
And how about enhancing their intelligence gathering capabilities, that there might have been pressure on an officer to enhance that by the use of sexual activity?
Well, in fact, that may well be true, but we didn't at any stage encourage or suggest it.
Thank you. It's understood that the meetings at the Safe House had a dual purpose. Part of it was admin and tasking and matters of that nature, but there was also a social purpose of
Yes.
it, to keep the undercover officer sort of grounded in his real life and have an opportunity to relax with like-minded individuals going through the same
Colleagues.
sorts of things and have a bit of time off, effectively. And I want to ask you a little bit about that now. Was that something that you were a supporter of, that period of time when they could simply just relax and be themselves?
Absolutely, yes.
And was that, once the sort of business side of the meetings was over, was it a relaxed and informal sort of atmosphere at the Safe House, as we've heard?
Yes, yes.
And you've told us, and it's been endorsed by officers that we've heard from, that the usual police hierarchies weren't so evident to the SDS. And did you feel the undercover officers were able to relax and be themselves with
We
you
did.
and Mike Ferguson present?
We did. It was an important part, I think, to see how they were behaving, and as you rightly point out, to give them an opportunity and an occasion where they could talk to colleagues and remind themselves that they're still in the job, which was very, very important.
Would somebody make lunch for you all?
Yes, they would, most probably in turns, would do their own cooking and present a meal.
And HN 304 has described those lunches as long and moist, indicating that officers had a drink or two. Can you remember that? Do you recognise that description of those lunches?
Long, I wouldn't deny. Moist, I mean, exactly, does moist mean? Yes, there was drinks, I guess, but there was never, and they couldn't afford to have any excessive drinking because all of them had cars or vans or whatever.
He also said it might be followed by a trip to the pub afterwards. Can you remember that?
Well, I wasn't part and parcel of that. It certainly wasn't with the back office management.
Right. You've described that the culture of the special branch at the time was very much a sort of, well, these were kind of men together,
Yes.
SDS, men together,
Yes.
exchanging banter, jokes, things of that nature.
Yeah.
And you've also said that very often there'd be sort of idle boasts about sexual prowess and things of that nature. Would that be right?
That would be quite right, yes.
And was that the atmosphere at the Safe House with these 12 men going through this sort of experience?
There'd be 12 men laughing and joking. Exactly what the content was would depend, I suppose. Yeah.
HN 304 has told us that often activists in the target groups would be the butt of some of that sort of banter. Can you remember that sort of
No.
laughing and joking about activists or
No,
their
to-
groups?
I didn't, I wasn't present for, most of the banter went in the group. I was dealing much more with the admin in a different room. And on occasions I did join the meal, the lunch or whatever, that sort of individual banter wasn't there. It was just general banter. There's no other word for it, really.
he also described that there were often jokes of a sexual nature, which I think you've accepted that was the sort of thing that would go on. Is that right?
Yes, I couldn't deny that. That most probably was.
And can you recall anything said about activists in that regard?
No, I certainly can't.
Sexual banter in front of you, was that something that you were perfectly happy to
It was something I'd been brought up with within the job, not outside the job.
Right. In particular, we have heard that there were jokes about the sexual prowess of HN 297 Rick Clark. HN 304 has said that there were managers present during conversations about Rick Clark, and that managers couldn't have failed to have understood that HN 297 Rick Clark was engaging in sexual activity in his undercover role. What's your reaction to that?
Well, his perception is completely wrong. Completely wrong.
Were you aware that he'd engaged in sexual activity in his undercover role?
No, I certainly wasn't.
And can you remember any sort of banter that might have suggested that there was any sexual activity with him going on?
No.
We have been told that HN 297 had a reputation as a womanizer. Does that surprise you? A description of him like that? I think a carnivore is how he's been described.
He was a very confident, outgoing person, and to me, he was the type who would brag about anything. He may well have been a womanizer, but I had no indication at all that he was indulging in such behaviour whilst on duty.
The sort of person who would have bragged about sexual conquests, was he that type?
Yes.
Does it surprise you to know now that he had sex with at least 4 women whilst he was undercover in the SDS?
Does it surprise me? I don't know really whether it does surprise me or not. I'm so used to being in the police for nearly 40 odd years, hearing about people involved with sexual encounters, that no, I don't suppose I was surprised. I was shocked, yes, because to me he had let not only the SDS down, he had let everyone down. And the end result is now this inquiry, and I think it's a great pity.
Give me a moment. You talk as if you now remember him letting everyone down. Is that right?
That his behaviour has let everyone down.
Yeah.
I'm saying, Chairman, that as a result of his behaviour, an inquiry has been set up which is delving into the whole operational practices of the SDS 50 years ago. And it's a great shame because one of the proud things of Special Branch was that the SDS was run without the general knowledge of the branch, let alone the police force or anyone else. But now the whole thing's been exposed, unravelled, and that's why I think it's a great shame that his behaviour, well, I'm ashamed of his behaviour, full stop.
I think we're at cross purposes. I had understood you to say that at the time you thought he had let everybody down.
No. At the Chairman, I didn't know he had been involved until this inquiry was started.
Well, I well understand that that was what you say in your witness statement and what you've said in evidence. And
Sorry if
I
confused.
misunderstood what you said.
Yep.
Thank you for clarifying it.
Thank you.
Forgive me.
HN 300, I don't know whether you need to remind yourself
do.
of who
I do
that
know.
is. Thank you very much. Were you aware of any reputation he had as a womanizer?
I wasn't initially when he, in fact, I don't recall when he actually joined the SDS, whether I was there at that time or not.
You weren't, I think.
I was.
You weren't. Not when he initially joined the
No.
SDS.
So there he was. And
Did you become aware of it?
yes, he was a strange character.
And did you become aware of it during the course of his SDS deployment?
I suspect so, yes. Later on towards the end of his stint.
He's been described by one of the officers in closed session as a sexual predator. Does that assessment accord with your memory of him?
I certainly would never put it into that category, but that's an individual opinion, isn't it?
You say you became aware of the fact that he was a womanizer or that sort of thing
Yeah.
during the course of the latter stages of
Yes.
his SDS deployment. He was withdrawn, we think, in November 1976, so about 5 or 6 or 7 months after you had joined the SDS. And we understand that he was withdrawn as a result of his falling in love with an activist. Can you recall that?
No, I certainly can't. I didn't know anything about that until the inquiry started.
What was it that you became aware of then during the course of his SDS deployment that caused you to think that there may be difficulties with him?
I think it was right at the end, general chit-chat, I think. If I recall correctly, he'd been married a couple of times, and I think his marriage was said to be on the rocks.
So is that the anxiety? His marriage was on the rocks, or that he was engaged in other sexual
No, well, actually, I thought
matters?
he was being withdrawn because his time was up.
I want to ask you about that, please. The inquiry has been told by an officer giving evidence in closed session that he was, HN 300, confessed to him that he'd fallen in love with an activist, and that officer, that closed officer, arranged a meeting with the SDS management in a pub, told them about it. Then HN 300 was then withdrawn, and the officer recalls that it was you that was spoken to about HN 300. Can you recall
No,
being informed about that?
definitely not. And all I can say is I don't remember any of those circumstances. And I've read the transcript of the officer concerned, and he didn't know the name of the person he told in the pub until my name was suggested. So
I think he mentioned that the officer with the Scottish name. I think that was as far as he could recall.
exactly, but whether it's a Scottish name or not, it wasn't me. I mean,
Right.
the circumstances, he enlarges on it, and the period of time 300 was with him, etc. So the circumstances are such, I couldn't fail but remember. I mean, it's extraordinary.
had you been told that an officer had fallen in love with an activist, what would you have done?
Well, it would have to be reported all the way up. He would have to come out. I mean, it would be a very serious position, and it was.
Would any disciplinary action have been taken against him, do you think?
I have no idea. It would have gone right up top. It wouldn't be anything an inspector would have a say in.
But it wouldn't be just contained to the STS then. A decision would be taken at much higher level and had to be reported up.
The discussions would go up the tree.
And might you have expected any further monitoring of him to ensure they didn't continue with any sort of relationship with an activist outside his deployment?
Again, that wouldn't be my decision.
We understand that he subsequently married this activist. Was that something that you were aware of at the time?
No, not until I was told.
And what is your reaction to that?
I find it amazing, and I find it amazing that rumour control kept that secret.
Would you have expected that to have resulted in any particular action taken by your superior officers?
I would think he would have to move out of special branch for a start. I mean, there's strong vetting, and it wouldn't meet the vetting criteria.
We also know that HN 354 and HN 21 engaged in sexual relationships but didn't disclose them to SDS managers, they say. Had they disclosed those relationships to you, is it likely they would have been subject to disciplinary proceedings?
Well, all the circumstances would have to be considered, and it could have happened. The senior management may have felt the circumstances were such that it wouldn't be a discipline.
Okay. HN 126, I don't know whether you need to look at the list
please.
to understand who that officer is.
Yes.
Do you have any recollection of hearing that he had become close to a member of his target group?
No.
No. HN 155, again, do you want to just check that you know who that is?
Yes, I do. No,
I think you overlapped for a very brief period of time. Two things, HN 155. Did you have any knowledge of HN 155 getting stoned with activists smoking marijuana?
no.
No.
H1, that particular officer, I don't think he actually went into the field during my time. He was in the back office.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Sir, I'm just about to move to another topic. I don't have a great deal left, but I wonder whether that might be an appropriate moment to draw stumps until I can finish off after lunch.
Certainly. It will give me a minute or two to ask about a topic you have asked about, which is troubling me. The officer who described how HN 300 came out of the field gave very clear evidence about what he had been told by HN 300 and what he did to deal with the matter by reporting it to one or other of the managers. In other words, the detective inspector or the detective chief inspector in the SDS. As a matter of dates, that is you and Jeff Craft. I mean, we know when these events occurred,
Yeah.
and you were in fact the detective inspector then, and
Right.
Jeff Craft was the detective chief inspector then.
Yes.
And one of the puzzles is that neither of you remembers clearly being in those positions together simultaneously.
That's correct, yes.
And I'm wondering whether, now you've read as you have what the closed officer had to say and reflected on it, you have any explanation which might enable me to work out what happened.
Well, I can only presume, but I can't actually produce any evidence to
No.
support this, Chairman. There's clearly in 1976 long periods where I wasn't actually working within the office due to, as I've mentioned,
Yeah.
various courses. And this event happened whilst I was away, and I say that because it's such a big event, such a serious event, that it would have stuck in my mind, and I'm sure it would have stuck in Jeff Craft's mind if I'd been with him. I wonder if there was an acting inspector, possibly Les Willingale, who was actually with Jeff Craft on that occasion. It certainly wasn't me. Well, I can't imagine that it's a sort of incident that I could honestly claim I can't recall.
So an explanation might be, that it was someone standing in your shoes temporarily,
Yes,
and it might have been Les Willingale.
that's the only
Yeah.
possibility
Okay.
I can come forward with.
Thank you for that. We will resume at 2, and you have roughly how long left?
Only about 20 minutes, I think.
Yes. Ms Hummerson will have 20 minutes of her own questions, and then we have a break of 20 minutes so that anybody else may raise topics with Ms Hummerson for her to ask you, and then you may be re-examined by your counsel.
Thank you very much.
But that will give you, I hope, some indication that your evidence may be finished by about 3 o'clock.